Life, culture, and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 with Neil Johnson on Vision.
As we do on a Tuesday, we like to check in with Alex Cook, our Ask Alex segment. Our talkback line is open right now on 1-800-316-316. You might have a question or a comment about finances. And in the meantime, we're going to be talking Alex's top biblical investing tips. Alex Cook, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be back with you.
Alex, the world is looking more uncertain. We've been talking about that over the weeks. Interest rates likely to rise again today here in Australia. However, there are some timeless investment truths, wisdom and strategies that we ought to be able to call on to get through these times. A special welcome along to you. Where do we start with talking about some top tips on biblical investing?
Well, look, I've broken it up into three different categories. And some of these themes within these people might be familiar with, and some not necessarily so much. The first category I've called is using our time wisely. You know, when you're investing, the reality is it takes time. Often when it comes to investing, we're in a hurry. You know, we've got an idea or a tip from somebody, and we want to get on with it. We want to make money. But reality is investing is a process that takes time and skill. In fact, from a biblical perspective, the way I love to think about it is from the parable of the gold bags. We find that in Matthew 25, and really it's a great passage on stewardship and stewarding the various things that God gives us. And some of the people may have heard their pastor preach on the 3 T's, as I call it. You got to steward your time, your talent, and your treasure. And when it comes to investing, there's a bit of all three. You know, you got to take time, you've got to use some talent and learn some skills, and of course you've got to use the treasure that God's put in your hands as well. But this category, though, of time, probably the first key tip here, and this is one most of us would have actually learned in primary school, believe it or not, and that is harnessing the benefit of compound interest. Now, all compound interest is, as Albert Einstein said, he said it was, I think, the greatest maths discovery of all time. I think he's even supposedly quoted as the 8th wonder of the world. But compound interest is simply earning interest on your interest. In other words, if you have an amount, let's say you invest $100,000 and it earns 5%, okay, you get $5,000 in your first year. In the next year, you'll earn interest not only on your principal, but also on the interest you earned last year. So it's just a simple concept of earning interest on your previously earned interest. But just to give people, I guess, a glimpse at the power of compound interest, if we go back and rewind in time to the year 1900, and imagine you just had a single dollar. If you'd invested that single dollar in the share market today, that would be worth close to $750,000 from one single dollar. So that is the wonder of compounding. The same thing occurs with the bank account, although obviously interest these days isn't as spectacular as it's been. But the point here is you've got to let time do the work. You've got to invest in something, and it can be cash, shares, bonds, various things, and you've got to allow time to do the work, because essentially compounding, you know, it gets to the point where it starts to grow up exponentially. So it's a fantastic way to build wealth, and it just takes time.
Interesting, isn't it?
The younger you start, the better.
Around compounding, sometimes if you remember back to what you did learn in school, the thought was that you did put your money in the bank, and that's where compounding was. You're saying here, Alex, all of these other dimensions, compounding is important as well. So compounding works across all of the investment strategies we might have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about the share market, most companies produce what we call dividends. In other words, that's your share in the profits of a company, and you can reinvest those dividends back into those shares. Many companies offer what they call dividend reinvestment plans, and essentially that's a form of compound interest. You're taking the profits and reinvesting it back into it, and over time it grows. And you know, historically the share market and property as well have been fabulous long-term investments that benefit from compounding.
And as we talk about these things, Alex, a biblical foundation for them. So for those who are thinking that, well, we shouldn't be talking about investing money and accumulating wealth because somehow or other that's got some evil aspects to it, this is very much a biblical thing for a foundation in how you actually manage and steward your investment.
Exactly. I mean, look, this is a very common concern amongst Christians, and it's probably because there's such mixed teaching out there on money in general. But the common concern is simply that as Christians, we shouldn't accumulate wealth. And I love the quote from John Wesley where he says, he's attributed as saying, make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. In other words, there's an element where we've all got to earn it, and then we've got to grow it, and then we've got to give it. And so I would argue that's a biblical responsibility. Now, of course, we don't grow wealth just for the sake of it. It's got to be grown for purpose. We're not trying to be the richest man in the graveyard because you can't take any of it with you when you go. And of course, as believers, we want to sow into things that have lasting value. But you've got to have something to sow. And so to me, this is really just, classic stewardship of taking what God's put in your hands and trying to grow it, and then to grow it, invest it, and then to give it. We want to use it for purposeful activity. So wealth accumulation is fine so long as it's other people centered. It's God centered. It's not centered around your personal kingdom.
So growing wealth is all good, and from time to time you need to remind yourself of the intentionality that you have in your pursuit of wealth, because all sorts of things can overtake that. Hey, let's move into some more of these principles for investing, some of your top tips. As one I've got in front of me here, time in, not timing. Don't time markets. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, look, this is probably the classic mistake that people make. These days we live in sort of a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news cycle. We're bombarded with news, whether it's on social media, radio, etc. And so we're surrounded by information. We live in that information age where we're surrounded by it. And as a result, there's a real temptation to sort of think to yourself, okay, I'm going to rely on that information to make decisions as to whether now is a good time to buy or sell. And my experience, and certainly the experience of professional fund managers, they'll all tell you the same thing, that it's near on impossible to time markets, to try and work out, if you ask me, Alex, what's the share market going to do today? My answer is I wouldn't have a clue. If you ask me where it's going to be in a year, I still wouldn't have a clue. If it's in 10 years, I'd say, well, look, more than likely, based on probability, it's likely to be much higher than what it is today. But you can't know that for sure. And so the point here is you just need to invest in good quality things rather than trying to time it, because you'll end up building up a lot of stress and probably not gain any real benefit from it. As I say, most professionals will tell you that you can't do it consistently for a very long period. It's just too hard.
Time is an interesting thing, and there's a number of dimensions to time around with our thoughts on investing.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, look, I think ultimately the key with investing is you need to have a long-term focus to it. When we look at history, particularly of investing in the share market and indeed property market, over a rolling sort of a 20-year period, there's been no periods of negative returns over those longer periods. In the short term, we can all point to things like the GFC and negative events, but over the longer term, these things take care of themselves. So to me, this is an issue of time works on your side, but you've got to have that long-term perspective. And then, of course, as a Christian, I think there's an extra dimension to that, and that is the eternal perspective, and that is that you're using your money in such a way that you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm not just investing here for my own personal benefit, I'm investing here because I want to sow into kingdom things. In other words, things that are going to have an eternal impact. And so that's, to me, the key issue with time is taking and investing is this having this long-term perspective. Don't get caught up in all the noise that we hear, day in, day out through the news cycle.
Okay, a long-term perspective, and for the Christian believer, an eternal perspective. Let's talk about the sorts of things you might invest in, the choices you make around asset purchases and those sorts of things. Alex, this is the second category that you were talking about.
Yeah, so I've called the second category asset choice. And really here you can break it up into a few things. And the good thing here is the Bible actually gives us fantastic wisdom here. And many people may have heard me quote this one before, because one of my favourites is Ecclesiastes 11:2, where it says, "Invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8, because you do not know what disaster may come upon the land." And of course, the last couple of years, most people have felt like there's been endless disasters, whether it's wars and COVID and all these things we're sick of hearing about. But really, this is just biblical wisdom staring us straight in the face here, and that is this idea that we need to diversify. You know, what I find that people do, and this is a real trap, is they tend to fall in love with one particular investment, either the share market or property, and they tend to not budge. They tend not to invest in anything else. And the danger here is that what you don't know going forward is which asset classes are going to give you the best returns, because every year it varies, and it can vary quite dramatically from year to year. And if you ask anyone, you know, which is going to be the best investment this year, shares, property or bonds, the short answer is no one knows. And so the important thing here is to diversify. Diversification reduces your volatility. You know, a lot of people, particularly at the moment, are concerned about the uncertainty of world events. So you can deal with that through diversifying, because that's going to reduce your volatility and reduce your risk. So that's a really important one. And that kind of then flows into the second, and that is that when it comes to choosing assets, you need to understand this concept of risk and return. And it's that classic case of the higher the potential return on investment, the higher the risk. And of course, you can run into the dangerous category, which is, you know, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. But the important point here is if you're going to invest in low risk assets, then like say cash in the bank, which pays very low, then you're going to get low returns over the long run. If you take a little bit more risk over time, say you invest in shares and real estate, then yes, it's a bit more risky. Yes, it's volatile. They can go up and down in value and so forth. But the returns over the longer term are going to compensate you for that additional risk you're taking. But you do have to take the longer time frame, and particularly important when you think about the context of the purpose of the money. You know, I often get young people come to me and, you know, they say 25 and they say, I want to buy a house in a year or two. And I say, well, you've got to put it all in the bank, because if you put it in the share market, you run the risk that you're going to lose money in the short term. If they say to me, actually, well, I don't want to buy for 10 years, I say, well, okay, now you can take a bit more risk and invest in more growth assets. So it's understanding these dynamics and choosing your assets wisely and diversifying to make sure that you're minimising your risks.
Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316 if you have a specific question around finances. Let me ask you one here, Alex. Given that you've got a history, you were a stockbroker in your early years, there's a saying that says buy in May and sell in November. Cycles are very interesting, and some people use those things as a rule of thumb. Any thoughts around cycles and where we might be even right now?
Yeah, no, look, it's a great question. And so, look, economics and investing are just ruled by cycles. You go through periods. In fact, if you look in Scripture and Israel as a nation going through periods of disobedience to God and then coming back to God, it's the same thing with investing and economics. You get periods of setbacks, such as recessions, and that's certainly been talked about quite a bit at the moment, both here and offshore. And the reality is often these cycles are opportunities, I think. You want to, we all want to try and time the cycle, but that's, as I say, very, very difficult to do. But the important point here is most cycles are just short-term setbacks. So if you get a recession, you get a downturn. If anything, those things are great opportunities to acquire assets at lower prices in a low point in the cycle. What you want to try and avoid is getting carried away. When times are good, people get carried away, they get exuberant, they get greedy, which is obviously something the Bible warns us very clearly against, and they think that the future will just be guaranteed, and that's very dangerous as well. So very important to understand that there is a cycle to investing and economics, boom bust, you hear that sort of expression. Same applies to shares and real estate and all of these things. And all it really means is ultimately you've got to accept the fact that these investments go up and down, and that you want to have a long-term view to how you hold them.
Interesting, just to stay on a little aside here, as you're sharing all sorts of wonderful wisdom here, the thought of greed and the sort of biblical sides of generosity and all of that, sometimes you've got to be able to monitor that greed in your own life because it can easily get a hold of you if you've got something to invest and you want to get into a cyclical way of doing things, and all of a sudden you find that there are some things that work and maybe I can leave God out of the equation and work very hard to accumulate wealth for the wrong reason. Any thoughts here on that? Really, it's like an emotional thing too, isn't it? A greed that can overtake you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a great thing. One of the things, and this is where it comes to investing in wealth creation in general, the Bible it never criticises wealth creation in and of itself, nor does it criticise the idea of having money. What it does do, though, is gives us lots of warning messages about what can happen to us when we fall in love with money and we become greedy. Greedy is this sort of insatiable desire for more. And as you sort of rightly point out, it's something you've actually got to monitor in your own life, because it's very easy to be seduced by money. Money is ultimately very seductive. And I think what tends to happen is that over time, as we get a bit of success, whether it's business success or investment success, we become overconfident and we start to believe it's us, not God, and that we forget God. And it can have a very negative impact on our relationship with God. In fact, one of my favourite verses is Deuteronomy 8:18, where it says, "Remember the Lord, for it is He who gives the ability to produce wealth." And what happens when people get wealth is they forget the Lord. They start to think it's themselves. They start to think they're a self-made person, and that is very dangerous. And it's a road to being humbled in the future. But yeah, as you say, we need to guard our hearts and we need to monitor this in ourselves. And, hopefully either we have a spouse or friends and so forth who can hold us accountable and make sure we don't get carried away, because that's where wealth is dangerous. It's a good thing as a good tool, but it can be dangerous if we let ourselves get seduced by it.
Well, the third of your three categories is around emotions, controlling your emotions, biblical foundations here. What ought we understand as Christians?
Well, look, this is one of the biggest barriers to sound investing is people's emotions getting involved in the decision making. I love Matthew 6, when we get told, don't worry about your life, what you're going to eat or drink, or your body, what you're going to wear, because God is, ultimately going to provide for us. He's our Heavenly Father. He feeds the birds of the air, and so He's going to look after us as well. So that's what we need to remember. And worrying just has a enormous negative impact on your decision making. And so unfortunately, because of the way the media paints things, when you get recessions and you get stock market crashes and these things, people's emotions get very much involved and they panic. So that the classic one is the stock market's fallen 20 or 30%, and so what do? They sell at the bottom rather than doing the exact opposite, which is looking at it rationally and saying, well, actually now things are 30% cheaper. So it's that kind of glass half full versus glass half empty kind of thing, and that emotion can have a very negative impact on your ability to invest well. In fact, in the stock market, you mentioned I was a broker. One of the classic cliches in the stockbroking world is that the stock market climbs a wall of worry. And what people say what they mean when they say that is there's always something to worry about. If you think about today, we're talking about interest rates rising potentially this afternoon. You've got inflation concerns. You've got recession. You've got war overseas. We've got food shortage. There's endless things that you could worry about. But the thing about that is that will paralyse you potentially and either make poor decisions or avoid making decisions at all. And so that's where emotions can come in and have a really negative effect. And so one simple tool here is I say to people, don't actually watch your investments that closely. Make good, sound investment choices, buy quality assets, whether it's shares or real estate, buy quality and hold them for the long term. But don't watch them every day. Don't log into the stock market every lunchtime to see what it's doing. Because if you do that, you're just sort of feeding these emotions and these fears, and you're likely to lead to poorer decision making over time. So yeah, don't let your emotions get involved.
We must mark a note for another day, because there's a whole different angle that can spring from this conversation. Because as I understand it, and you might know some more about this, Alex, but technology today has artificial intelligence monitoring and anticipating the future of stock markets and investment markets, and there is a sense in which big business and wealthy investors are using all sorts of other technology. So it's not just about the emotions. The machinery gets in there and actually anticipates that for you. I don't know, is that a big dimension we could explore sometime?
Well, it is. Roughly 80% of the trading on the US stock market is computers trading amongst themselves. That's how huge it is. It's massive. And so, yeah, that's certainly a topic, how technology interfaces with all of this, and how you can also use technology to your advantage as well. So, big area.
We'll tackle that on another day, because there are all sorts of things that people can use and access, apps and all sorts of websites that can help people do that sort of thing, but we'll save that for another time. Alex Cook, always so good getting your insights. And let me point listeners to how they can connect with you. You can visit the website wealthwithpurpose.com. wealthwithpurpose.com. Lots of free resources there available to enhance your biblical understanding of how to use your wealth and how to accumulate wealth. You can follow Alex on Facebook or on Twitter. There is an Ask Alex at wealthwithpurpose.com email. And each week we have this segment with Alex Cook, and we open our talkback lines, and oftentimes there are some good calls that come through. You do need to be quick with those calls to get in. It's not a long segment, but Alex Cook, anticipating another good one next week. But thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts, your insights and your expertise with us today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be with you as always.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.